Welcome to Doing What Works, Exploring the Blue Economy, a podcast series that dives deep into the vast potential and challenges of the blue economy. I'm your host, Ashanti Blaize-Hopkins, Interim Associate Dean at the Santa Monica College Center for Media and Design. Together, we'll navigate the uncharted waters of this exciting and rapidly growing sector. Joining us on the podcast today is someone who is passionate about problem solving at the intersection of sustainable food and healthy ecosystems. He is an ecologist by trade with deep roots as an educator. Currently, he is the Science, Sustainability, and Farm Education Manager at Hog Island Oyster Company, an organization that raises 5 edible oyster varieties on 250 acres of intertidal lands in Tamales and Humboldt Bays. Dr. Gary Fleener, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, Ashanti. It's great to be here with you today.
Our first question is always the same for all of our Doing What Works podcast guests. What was your first job ever? And how does what you learned in that job impact what you do today?
Wow, that's going to take me back a couple of years. My first job was mowing lawns in Tulsa, Oklahoma at age 12. I have that classic story. One day my dad came home with a brand new mower and he said, "This is for you, son. And all you have to do is mow my lawn for me. And you can do whatever else you want with that mower." So I dragged that mower around the neighborhood for the next several years, cutting grass and taking care of people's lawns as a young entrepreneur. And yeah, that's how it all started.
Feels like even then you were kind of taking care of the earth in your own way, right?
I think I was taking care of my bank account mostly.
That's fair. That's fair. Let me ask you, is the ocean something that you've always been interested in? When did you discover a passion for it? And when did you also discover that you could turn this into a career?
Ashanti, that's a great question because I am a Midwesterner by birth, and I did my graduate schooling in Colorado and was educated more in the freshwater realm on rivers of the Mountain West. And for me, the ocean was a sort of a vast and almost terrifying space that I really didn't understand very well until, obviously I'd been to the beach, I'd been to the coast, but when we moved to California, my family and I, about 12 years ago, my career interests and personal interests had really gravitated from being an ecologist in the mountain landscape to being deeply interested in food systems and foodways. Everywhere that I looked and went in the world, I realized that the main way that people interact with their environment is typically through their mouths, their stomachs. They're finding food, they're changing the landscape from one kind of ecosystem to another to produce food. And when we moved to California, I discovered, much to my sort of joy and surprise, that there was this whole world of ocean farming and aquaculture. And Hog Island Oyster Company, where I have the great opportunity to work now, is actually my gateway into that as a customer, eating oysters and mussels and clams. And so the long arc of my career did not include as much ocean work, but about 10, 12 years ago, I was able to take that toolbox of being an educator. I had an academic career before that, and an ecologist, and train those tools on the food systems of the nearshore environment. And that's still where my passion and energy lies today.
You mentioned that a lot of folks experience their environment through their mouths, through food, right? And when most people think about oysters, the idea that someone on a farm is raising them may not immediately come to mind, right? What are you all doing in this aquaculture or farming underwater? What can you tell me about how Hog Island Oyster Company came to be and how it's grown throughout the years in that space?
Sure. Well, so there's a couple of really important distinctions as we launch into this conversation. And one of the primary ones is the difference between what we consider fed aquaculture and unfed aquaculture. So fed aquaculture would be fisheries, anything where you have to feed the animals that you're growing. And unfed aquaculture was something I didn't really have much of a sense of a decade ago. That's the producing of animals and, in fact, macroalgae like seaweeds that don't need to be fed. Essentially, it's more like a ranching proposition where you put them in the water, you steward them, but they're growing and feeding off the abundance of a natural resource. In the case of oysters, clams, and mussels, that's phytoplankton. That's a small microscopic photosynthesizing organisms. And in the case of seaweeds, it's sunlight and the nutrients that are available in the water. And so the story of oyster farming, and we might look more largely at bivalve mollusks, so oysters, clams, mussels, scallops, we call them farmed, but in fact, those animals are completely built off the natural resource base of the environment, the ocean environment that they're grown in, whether that's a bay and estuary for clams and oysters, or in more of an open water environment for mussels or potentially scallops. It's the pasture-raised version, if you will. And so when we say that they're being farmed, they're really being tended by humans in a wild environment that's subject to both the resource abundance and environmental uncertainty of that wild environment. Hog Island is a wonderful company. The founders who still run the company today, John Finger and Terry Sawyer, I think both had marine science backgrounds, and they were drawn to this proposition of growing sustainable animal protein in the ocean. I think there might have been a surfboard or two on their roofs back 40 years ago when the company was started. That fundamental commitment to producing a delicious, nutritious, and sustainable food, I think, has always undergirded the company. They did hit a quantum amplifier about 20 years ago when they moved from being strictly primarily a farming to the back doors of restaurants kind of operation to having their own restaurants. So today, Hog Island has 5 restaurants around the Bay Area. The company serves roughly 500,000 people a year. And I like to tell people that the restaurants are where the money gets made and where we tell the story, share the story of what Hog Island does. But the farms are still really at the soul of the business. And Hog Island is one of the only true, it's not just farm to table. I tell people it's larvae to table, right? Because we actually have a hatchery operation in Humboldt Bay in far northern California, and a nursery operation. We have farms in Humboldt and Tamaulipas, and then we have these restaurants where we can take the food to the people, if you will. And so it's an interesting company, and I think it's created a unique opportunity for somebody like me, because if it were strictly a restaurant business, there might not be as much of a place for an ecologist. But when you're growing food in the ocean, you really have to pay attention to the variables. And that's fundamentally a scientific and biological endeavor, because growing wild, growing farmed animals or plants, in the case of seaweeds, algae, in a wild environment is fundamentally an ecological proposition. And so I think they built the company on their own toolboxes of knowledge about the marine environment, and that continues today. But as it's gotten to be a bigger company, there's a place for somebody like myself. In fact, we have a small team of folks that work on everything from water quality issues to environmental monitoring to trying to think through what we call developing climate resilient shellfish, right? How do we prepare for climate uncertainty when we can't really, there's no knobs on the ocean, right? We can't really change the environmental conditions on the farm, but perhaps we can work at our hatchery to breed animals that are more resilient to climate stressors. So it's a super interesting proposition.
It's interesting that the two founders are still very much involved, and to hear how the company has evolved through time. What were the challenges in getting Hog Island Oyster Company off the ground back in 1983 when it was founded? It really feels like the company was almost ahead of its time in many ways.
That's a good question. And if I could channel John or Terry's voice on this, I think that those first 20 years, and especially in the 80s, it was pretty close to the bone at times. When you're in any farming operation, when you are growing food and then you have to sell it into the supply chain at that early part of the arc from farm to table, you make less money. And it is very hard work, the work that's being done out on the farm. So I do think one of the things that really helped was that John and Terry advanced. When they started in the early 80s, most oyster farming on the West Coast and really around North America was growing oysters for the shucked market, meaning the animals were grown in fairly rough clusters. Then they would be opened in a shucking house and packed into jars and sold shucked. The whole oysters on the half shell thing hadn't really quite hit, but so timing was important in the Malcolm Gladwell sense, and I think the early 80s saw a couple of important things. In the Bay Area, it was really the accelerating of the farm to table movement. Chez Panisse, Alice Waters' work, and Zuni, those restaurants were taking off, and John and Terry were able, through a great supply chain network, to get into those restaurants and build their brand through association with these important farm to table organizations like Chez Panisse. But also the sushi craze was really amping up in the 80s, and I think the American public's interest in eating raw seafoods was also evolving. So I think the 80s was a great time to hop on that train, but I think they busted their butts and their backs quite a bit in those first 2 decades and built their brand to a point where, when some redevelopment was happening in San Francisco, they were invited to join into a new idea for a downtown San Francisco that would feature small producers from around the North Bay. For folks, listeners who might be familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, the Ferry Building down on the water was really reimagined in the early 2000s. And opening the Oyster Bar there really, changed the business model, because it took that hard work of the first 20 years and kind of blew it up by linking the productivity and profitability of a restaurant with all the work that had gone in the 20 years before that.
What lessons did the founders of Hog Island Oyster Company learn along the way that might serve other similar businesses or entrepreneurs hoping to open their own aquaculture businesses in California? With new legislation in the state of California, is it easier then? Is it easier now than it was back in 1983 to get started in this space?
It is much more challenging now. One of the opportunities that I have been able to grow from in my last couple of years is starting to support the company's permitting and regulatory interactions. And it's an interesting space. And again, I'm a learner. I'm a lifelong learner. And so as I learn this space, California is a state that has placed a very, very high importance on protecting coastal resources. It has the California Coastal Commission. Anything that's involved with the coastal environment that involves modifying it in any way is very carefully scrutinized and managed for all the right reasons, right? However, in the case of ocean farming, and this is really true for, and we're going to strictly stay on that side of unfed aquaculture, right? So shellfish, and then of course the newly emerging area of seaweed aquaculture, which is also super interesting. Those activities, even though they bring with them probably almost certainly tremendous environmental benefits, they do environmental services, whether that's filtration or the uptake of CO2 in the case of marine algae. Any aquaculture is an incursion, a developmental incursion into the coastal zone. And that triggers tremendous amounts of scrutiny and process, which again is all part of how the state has built multiple levels of safety valves for protecting the coastal zone. But currently today, a seaweed farm, an oyster farm is regulated and permitted in a way that's really not very much different than a condo complex or a golf course, a power plant. And we're hopeful that as time goes by and we can utilize scientific research, which is partly what I do a lot of coordinating with academic scientists up and down the coast to really build the case for unfed aquaculture as a food producing system that also provides, if properly done, properly managed, net benefits and services to the ecosystems around where it's happening. And if that's the case, then hopefully we may get to a place where the pathway for permitting and regulatory activities is different for in the way that our colleagues at the Nature Conservancy would refer to as restorative. It's a food producing system that's nature positive rather than nature negative. And in that sense, maybe we'll get to a place where we're regulated in that way. Today, the best estimates, the Western Regional Aquaculture Center, which is really a federal agency, has determined that it's about $150,000 to permit a new farm on the West Coast. If you average in Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, and look at them all. And that's really outside the budget of most aspirational young ocean farmers, And so I think 40 years ago, the fun company narrative is that John borrowed $500 and got his start in oystering in Tomales Bay. And I'm not sure if those are exactly the right numbers, but it gives you a sense of scale from a $500 startup to a $150,000 startup. It's a very different proposition. The other thing that's important to acknowledge in the state of California, regardless of the regulatory landscape, is that most unfed aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture, seaweed aquaculture needs to take place either in a protected bay or estuary or offshore. And currently there's very little precedent. Offshore aquaculture is really in its infancy. And there's not very many clean bays and estuaries in the state of California. It's a very rugged coastline. And our biggest bays and estuaries like San Francisco and San Diego are not really food grade estuaries in terms of water quality. So that leaves us with Humboldt, Tomales, and Morro Bay for the most part. And Humboldt Bay is approaching saturation and also is now facing changes as the state prioritizes wind energy development and how will those prioritizations interact with aquaculture. Tomales Bay is, there's plenty of room in Tomales Bay, but Tomales Bay is a very complex regulatory landscape. It's a national marine sanctuary. There's a national park, state parks, and Morro Bay is very small, and the water quality there is right on the cusp of being suitable. So even if the regulatory landscape was much easier, the way we think about where aquaculture can happen, again, unfed aquaculture is somewhat constrained simply by locations. That's where I think the real promise is with some of these offshore seaweed and mussel farms that are being developed and proposed, particularly right now in Southern California.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about kind of the sustainability piece of kind of what Hog Island is doing and many aquaculture businesses that are already set up and running. How important from a sustainability standpoint is the work that you do at Hog Island Oyster Company? And how does what you do impact the environment and those who live in California? Why should the everyday person care what it is you do?
Sure. No, that's a fabulous question, and one that's really near and dear to my heart, and I think our heart here at Hog Island. So let's split that into two broad categories. One would be the more typical conversation about the ecosystem services that shellfish, filter feeding bivalves, and seaweeds play while the food is growing. What is happening to the environment? So if we take a strictly terrestrial animal protein model, even a pastured poultry, which let's say receives very little feed, still has a high freshwater requirement. Typically, when you convert a landscape from whatever the native vegetation was, forests, grasslands, and you make it into a foraging landscape for, my boy and I raised chickens for years. Let's use pastured poultry, Animal protein on land, the production of animal protein requires a large freshwater input. It requires a feed input of some type, and it requires the conversion of one natural ecosystem to a more simplified, less natural ecosystem. Doesn't mean it can't be really rich and beautiful and biodiverse on that farm. But with filter feeders like oysters, clams, mussels, you're producing a nutrient-dense, highly nutritious animal protein with no freshwater inputs, zero, no feed inputs, zero. And you're modifying a natural ecosystem to host those animals, but you're modifying it only slightly and in a way that a lot of good science shows in many cases increases the species diversity and abundance at that location. So if you imagine that oyster baskets or oyster gear, if they're again thoughtfully placed with some kind of best management practices in there, now you have what amount to kind of artificial reefs, right? And those become aggregators for juvenile fishes, larval Dungeness crabs, and even the shells of the oysters host tremendous structural diversity. So we talk about, when I do educational program, we talk about the ecosystem services largely in those terms. As oysters filter out the phytoplankton that they're building their bodies out of, they also filter out a lot of other sediment and debris in the water. And they have a remarkable biological function. And you may have to edit this out, but oysters have two poop chutes. What? So what does that mean? Well, because people are like, well, if they're filtering all that stuff, I don't want to eat that stuff. And what's amazing, because without the benefit of brains or eyes, they're filtering everything that's in the water column, but they have this remarkable ability to sort that material that they're filtering into the phytoplankton that they want to eat, which goes through their digestive tract, gets processed as food, and everything else gets packed into a little mucousy pellet and deposited through a secondary chute. That's poop chute number 2, if you will. And it has the wonderful name of a pseudo-feces at this point, and that gets deposited on the seafloor. Well, what an amazing thing to take that detritus that's in suspension and pelletize it and put it on the seafloor. And they're doing this whether they're wild oysters or farmed oysters or whatever. And that clarifying of the water allows better light penetration. That means the photosynthesizers like eelgrass or macroalgae can do their photosynthesizing better. So that's a powerful service right there. They're great at uptaking surplus nitrogen in the water. And in fact, in New York City, maybe you've heard of the Billion Oyster Project. They're deploying lots of oysters, not as food currently, but to clean up the water for these filtration services and for these nitrogen uptake services. And then the other block is this, what we call habitat provisioning. So by virtue of putting these animals out there, we're creating habitat, providing habitat that's useful to other animals. So those are the ecosystem services that we tend to think about as environmental benefits. And again, these just happen as essentially a side benefit of producing this nutrient-dense animal protein that requires no freshwater inputs, no feed. And of course, with seaweeds, you're getting kind of the vegetal equivalent, right? They're taking up in exchange for sunlight and ocean nutrients. You're getting CO2 uptake. You're getting an incredibly nutrient-dense vegetable material that has habitat provisioning values. And again, no freshwater inputs, it's a heck of a meal when you bring those together. You got your salad, you got your nutrient dense animal protein, and it's a pretty good gig.
Well, I definitely learned something today about oysters. I had no idea they had two poop chutes.
There you go. I know. Listeners want to know.
The listeners want to know. Exactly. So at Santa Monica College, we're very fortunate to have an aquaculture program launching in the spring of 2024. Can you tell me the types of careers that might await students who complete this program, and what kind of skills do you think they need in order to work at a company like Hog Island or others in the aquaculture space?
Yeah, Ashanti, that's a great question. I would say that two or three things. One is be a generalist in terms of learning about the ocean environment. If there's one thing that comes up around here at Hog Island frequently, and I know from colleagues at other companies up and down the coast, sure, you might work on the farm crew, planting shellfish, harvesting shellfish, or in the hatchery. But you have to do your work with a lens and a background appreciation for the ocean environment. We are fundamentally players in a much larger venue, and you really can't. You have to see the work of ocean aquaculture from that broadly informed background of ocean, marine biology, ocean ecology, ocean chemistry. Sorry, kids, chemistry still matters.
Still a thing.
I know it's tough. But so much of the ocean that we experience, and I like saying this. I learned to say this here at Hog Island, but we're a company built on the backs of some very tiny, tiny organisms, because behind our oysters is phytoplankton, right? And phytoplankton are amazing single-celled photosynthesizers who are swimming in chemistry, right? And so, number one, learn broadly. You're not going to make it in this industry by being too much of a specialist. The second is be willing to jump into industry where the opportunity presents itself, right? Right now, in California especially, and Southern California, Santa Monica is a great place to be, because a lot of this offshore aquaculture growth is happening in Southern California. And I think that the job opportunities will, in a related way, also be blooming down there. But, I kid you not. I've had a PhD. I'm an old guy, old bald guy, and I had an academic career. I was tenured. But when I came to Hog Island, I first came as a customer. I became smitten with what they were doing, but I was willing to do whatever was available and learn about what was happening here. And so I spent my first few years telling stories as kind of a docent and, did some dishes here and there. And I think being willing to find your opportunity wherever it presents itself in the field is super important, because right now there aren't a lot of we're looking for a master's degreed or certificated person to do exactly this thing. You're going to do a little bit of everything. Whatever the job title may say, we're going to squeeze a little bit of everything out of you, right? And the third thing I would say is one of the things that makes this proposition so interesting, and of course, Hog Island is a little unique in California because we have a nursery, we have a hatchery, we have farms, but we also have restaurants. So we engage with, around 300 employees with different experiences. Some work on our restaurant side. We have culinary people. We have hatchery technician type people. But again, it's related to the first thing I said. See it in the big picture. I think that aquaculture is fundamentally about food systems, right? It's a way of producing food in the ocean. If it's marine, mariculture broadly, it could be raising trout or tilapia in a freshwater place, but ultimately it links back to food systems. And I think it's important for us all to realize that we're whether you want to have your boots in the water and work next to the ocean, that's all great. But ultimately it's about growing nutritious food for people in a way that not only is not nature negative, but ultimately is nature positive, which I think is what an incredible thing that there's a place. And I want to give a nod because I spent years, I have a lot of great friends that are working in the terrestrial landscape, also working to grow incredible food in a way that's nature positive. It's not that opportunity doesn't exist on land, but it's growing rapidly in the marine sector. And I think seeing holistically is super important.
Dr. Gary Fleener, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights and expertise with us. And thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the blue economy. We hope this episode has inspired you to explore further and learn more about this vital sector. If you enjoyed doing what works, exploring the blue economy, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes that push the boundaries of knowledge and open new possibilities. Until next time.